Welcome back, everybody. It's 3:40. It's Friday of week 5. We're just talking about the syllabus and looking ahead to next week, in which we have our review and test number 1. Review is going to be on Wednesday. Jose is going to basically go through the test with you. Read you the questions, see what you learned from the class. And if you know all the answers to the questions that he's going to ask you, then you're going to do real well on the test because it's from the same batch of questions. If you don't, it's a good indication of the things you might want to take a look at and study. He's also going to create a video lecture, and I'll be uploading that hopefully by Monday for you to watch if you weren't here on Wednesday or if you're not going to be here on Wednesday. On Friday, we're not going to have an in-person class. We have the test on Friday, and we'll put a sign on the door in case you forget. That way you're not just sitting in here, and Jose will be sitting in here as well to direct you. This room will be open if you want to take a test in here and use your laptop. That's cool. The room will be here. If not, if you don't, want to take it at home, you can go to the coffee shop. You can go to the library. There are computers. University Computing Center UTC over there has computers, and business has computers. So lots of opportunities for you to take the test. But we're not going to do like Scantron, lo-fi beats on the background like we used to. So we'll do that. And then coming up a week after that is Mesoamerica, including our guest lecturer for our Cynthia Irwin-Williams lectureship, who's going to be 2 weeks from today, talking to us. Christina Baines is going to be talking to us about her research among the modern Maya. So lots of cool stuff coming up in the next couple of weeks. But, before we get to that, we got to get through test number 1. You also have homework number 4, discussion board number 3, and quiz number 4 due this week. And I'm going to have Jose go back this weekend and start putting zeros in. So if you haven't done your work, please turn it in soon, or else you're going to get them zeros. Okay. So we're going to talk about Pacific Northwest again today. Somebody refresh me. One of the questions, actually, I was just looking over your essay questions on the test. Spoiler alert, right? One of the questions is, what are the major ecological, cultural, and social differences between Native American groups in the Southwest and those of the Pacific Northwest? How would you answer that question? That's literally one of 3 essay questions on your test. Yeah. How are they different or similar?
There's no on agriculture.
In the Northwest, yeah, they're a fishing society, right? Marine resources. So from a very ecological determinism or ecological infrastructural base, they have a very different base of how they get their resources. They're both complex societies, but they're built on different substructures, right? One is agricultural, one is fishing. What's another difference that we saw? It's a good start. Did you see anything different? We'll talk about we talked about this last time, right? Social complexity, maybe how society is organized different. We'll talk a little bit more about that today. But the ranked society, right? Having chiefs and all the way down to commoners and slaves. We'll also we've talked about art. We talked about some of the different art forms that we see. What are the primary art forms you see in the Southwest? Pottery. Yeah, it's mostly pottery. And how about in the Pacific Northwest coast? What do they like to do? Wood. Yeah, it's all wood stuff, right? And we're going to talk about the colonial encounter today, and that's also a good source of difference, right? How was the colonial encounter with the Spanish in the Southwest, which we talked about last week with Pueblo Revolt and the Frontera movie? We're going to talk a little bit about the colonial encounter with the British, the Russians, and the Americans today, and you can think about how that's a little bit different. Okay. I also want to talk about social organization, right? Well, this is Elman Service. He's a famous anthropologist from back in the day, who, for those of you who are anthropology majors, probably know the band, tribe, chiefdom, state typology. You heard of that, right? That there are bands, small groups of hunting and gathering people, usually 10 to 50 people, kind of wandering around the landscape, often doing hunting and gathering kind of stuff. These societies are mostly egalitarian, which means everybody is doing pretty much the same thing. Career day at hunting and gathering school is pretty easy because they say, what do you want to be when you grow up? And you say hunter and gatherer, and everybody says that, right? There's not a lot of differences between people, either materially, right? People live in more or less the same kind of houses as your neighbors. You don't have a whole lot of material wealth differences. No, nobody's driving a Bentley while other people are riding a bicycle. There isn't a lot of political authority either, at least hereditary political authority. You may have somebody who's in charge for like warfare or, you know, a spiritual leader, but those are not like often passed down, right? They are the best person at the time, versus in other complex societies, you start to get kings and emperors and things like that. Economically, most band societies or hunting and gathering societies are based on what we call reciprocity, which is an anthropological fancy name for sharing. Share with your neighbors and they will share back. If you live in one of these societies and you don't share, what happens to you? What happens if you don't share? You're out, right? You're out. You're not part of this. Because everybody in hunting and gathering society is related. Either your blood relatives or your married relatives or your cousins, right? And so to not share is to break those social bonds. And more importantly, if you don't share what you have, people aren't going to share back. So in times of stress, environmental hardship, drought, and famine, right? Sharing is how you get by with with your friends, versus trying to be the wealthiest person or keep it all for yourself. Unlike bands, right, there are other groups, tribes. These are often horticultural or pastoral people, which means animals, right? Usually these are groups of between 100 or 500 people. They have some level of wealth or tribal, you know, or property, especially on the clan level. Clans or family groups own land or resources. And they still have a lot of reciprocity, but a more monetary system. Often kind of having a leader of some kind of village headman. This could be earned through, you know, kind of doing stuff that's really impressive, being a warrior, or being an eloquent person. But oftentimes, right, in a tribal society, it's about what you make of it yourself. And that little baby of yours, you know, has to prove themselves. They don't get to be king just because dad was king, right? In a tribal society, social organization is basically based on family, extended families, lineages, clans. We see this in the Pacific Northwest, you know, as well. We'll talk about chiefdoms in a second. But you can think of like a totem pole, right? Everybody who's part of the Raven clan or the Bear clan or something like that. And they all work together for common good. When we talk about Pacific Northwest, we're really talking about chiefdom level societies, right? These are formalized chiefdoms, often having larger population. We often think of them as agricultural civilizations, but the Northwest is a great example of societies which, you know, are not agricultural, but still have this level of complexity, which again is why we talked about earlier, why maybe it's so interesting to study these societies, because they seem to be, you know, an outlier in our normal understanding. Unlike tribal societies, though, these societies we're talking about in the Pacific Northwest do have leaders that are hereditary, right? Hereditary chiefs. A lot of the ranking that we talked about last time comes from that, right? I'm the firstborn son of the last chief, so I should be chief, right? Or I'm the firstborn son of a firstborn son of a firstborn son, going all the way back to when killer whale spirit first, you know, swam in the ocean or something like that. These societies often have either what we call like ranked societies, like you know, some kind of stratification from chief to commoner, or maybe some kind of division about who is who in society, and not just anybody gets to be in charge, right? A slave can never be in charge because they don't have that inherent, you know, what we would call Pacific mana. But we see very similar concepts in the, you know, in the Pacific Northwest. So there's something innate about these chiefs, right, or high prestige people, which allows them to be leaders, right? There's some kind of magical or innate spiritual quality which makes you better than other people. Oftentimes in these societies, we start to see the accumulation of a lot of stuff. It's going to be real different from hunting and gathering societies, especially if you're walking around all the time, you don't want to carry too much stuff. But chiefdom societies especially start to accrue stuff, and we start to see the flow of resources upwards, right? So the beginning of dreaded taxes, you got to give to the chief, right? A little tithe every year to make sure that the chief can redistribute them to other people in society. It's the beginning of centralization and all these kind of concepts, which we see in anthropology. One of the ways that chiefs especially redistribute their wealth, like today, you pay your taxes and you give maybe to a church or something and they redistribute it. But in the Pacific Northwest, they had an interesting custom known as the potlatch. Is the potlatch, which was a mechanism that chiefs used to redistribute their wealth. And we'll start with this actually because it is a pre-colonial custom, but it has been really impacted by colonials. So we're going to watch a couple of films today, some about the potlatch. We'll talk about Chief Seattle a little bit because he's on your test. And then we'll talk about some of the modern issues with dams, right? All right. Yeah. So a potlatch is a giveaway ceremony, right? And it's competitive in order to transform wealth into prestige, right? Which seems very interesting. Those of you in theory, we've talked about this in the next class after that. But in these societies, right, to be a chief and to gain prestige and to move up the hierarchy was all about how much you could give away, which seems really interesting in our modern society, right? In our modern society, people who are very rich, right, you're famous or you get prestige because you are rich, right? Elon Musk is famous because he's rich, more or less, right? But in these societies, you basically take wealth and you convert it into social prestige, right? So instead of being just super rich, I'm going to have a big party. And I'm going to invite you all to my party. And I'm going to give you things, right? Oftentimes, this is either associated with like warfare or like tribal competitions between different clans, or when there's going to be a new chief and there's some question about who should be the chief, they'll have these competitive gift givings, right? So say it's my turn. I'm going to invite everybody to one of these long houses. This is kind of the cedar house we'll see in just a minute. I'm going to invite everybody in the local area over. I'm going to invite my friends. I'm going to invite my family. But I'm also going to invite my enemies and my rivals, which is kind of interesting. Why would I do that? I want to show off, right? I want them to bask in my glory, right? There's no better way to show your rivals up than to have them present, right? Because if they're not there, they can be like, I heard it sucked, right? But if they're there, you can really rub it in their faces. So you have everybody come in, they come over by a canoe, and you basically party down for a couple of days. And the guy who's going out for chief, usually what you do is you collect a bunch of wealth to give away. This is over a period of years even. You collect stuff yourself and you ask all your family members and your friends to help you. Give me some stuff so I can give it away, right? And this is all about, in many ways, this is a good indication of who's going to be a good chief, right? If you can persuade your friends and family to work together towards a common goal of like helping you out, then you're probably a good leader in the first place, right? So then you have this big party, often associated with these ceremonial masks and dancing, these kind of mythological ceremonies in which the characters from the totem poles come to life through these masked dancers. It's often very, cinematic almost, or very theatrical. It's very dark in there, fires, bonfires kind of going. And then they drop like a big curtain and all these masked dancers come in reenacting all the myths, right? After these kind of religious thing goes on, oftentimes the giveaway will begin. And what's really interesting about the giveaway in itself is that oftentimes there's like a secondary person who's like a speaker, right? You hire somebody or you got your grandma or somebody who basically talks you up, right? This guy, he's awesome. This lady, she's awesome, right? She's the greatest leader. She takes care of their people, right? They give things away. They're super generous. They help their people, right? And then things get given away. Back in the day, it was blankets. It was dried fish. It was kind of these art objects. They make these big copper discs, oftentimes were given away. And basically the idea was to give away the most stuff you can at your party. And then everybody else, then the next group will have a party the next week or a month later. And basically whoever has the best party or whoever gives away, the most stuff gets to be in charge. Right? It's a very interesting concept. It's very different from our own. And we'll look at how this happened, what's happened with colonialism in just a second. But I did want to show you a quick video. This actually was going on until, fairly in the late 1800s, early 1900s, which is after the development of the camera and the moving pictures, right? So we actually have some documentation from some of these really early potlatch ceremonies during the colonial period, which I want to show you. And then we'll talk about what happened to them.
Born to be a chief, it was James Seaweed's role to give potlatches share as well. Now 60
colonial authorities. Glad you asked. In the Pacific Northwest, we're generally talking about primarily British in the kind of the southern part in what's today Canada. Up towards Alaska, we're talking about Russian fur trappers, and we'll talk more about them, especially when we do the Arctic later in the semester. And then later on, especially in the 1800s, with American settlers, right, as Americans moved west first in the kind of the gold rush of the 1849, and then later in like the 1850s and 60s, moving up into like Washington, Oregon, settling of what we know today as like Seattle, places like that. During this time period, like you saw, there was a lot of changes in these societies, right? Both in terms of social organization, right? These different groups, which were often at war with each other, were made to be at peace. A loss of resources, especially, right? These are people who had lots of their land taken away and given to settlers. And we'll look at Chief Seattle in just a second. As well as their cultural practices outlawed, and potlatch is a great example of it. Missionaries and government workers both worked together to kind of outlaw the potlatch practice. Government people saw it as a waste of economic resources, right? You're just having these big parties. Why don't you devote yourself towards like bettering your economic situation? And missionaries saw it as kind of backsliding into paganism and having these kind of religious or ritualistic kind of overtones as well. But beginning in the 1960s, this started to change, right? The laws in Canada were changed so that the potlatch was no longer illegal. And today people do potlatch again. It's super interesting. And you can go, people in the Northwest coast, even today, there are still chiefs among these groups, and you follow basically the ancient customs to get your chiefly privileges. You have this potlatch. Instead of blankets and canoes, now it's shotguns and outboard motors and watches and whatever, cell phones or whatever people are giving away. But despite kind of the differences in the material culture, the idea is very similar. And so this is kind of another 2-minute little section about one of the more modern potlatches. This is actually in the 60s, so it's not super modern, but one of the first potlatches that happened after the ban was repealed. One of the figures kind of most associated with the loss of tribal lands, and also kind of the environmental movement in the United States, is this guy, Chief Seattle. You've probably famous from, dorm room posters. There he is, Chief Seattle, and often for his famous speech. There it is. Something like that, right? How can you buy or sell the sky, the warmth of the land? The idea is strange to us. I own the freshness of the air and the sparkle of water. How can you buy them? Every part of the earth is sacred to my people, right? And we'll take a look at it in a second. During this time period, right, again, in the 1800s, while different groups, right, the groups on the East Coast, right, had been in contact and had been colonized by European settlers for quite a long time, right? On the West Coast, it was a little bit different. It was until the mid to late kind of 20th century or 19th century that large scale colonization starts to happen, right? Before that, you have fur trappers and you have kind of occasional explorers and things like that. But not, not a ton. But show me a picture. There it is. Beginning in the 1850s and 1860s, right? There started to be kind of an influx of American settlers and Canadian settlers into the region, forcing traditional people off of their land. And Chief Seattle was a leader of the Duwamish or the Duwamish or the Squamish tribes during this time, and he really emphasizes, or he really is an emblem of kind of the differences that occurred during his lifetime. Where he was born in the 1780s, so like right after the American Revolution, and he died in 1866. And as a young man, right, he claims to have seen some of the first white explorers in the area exploring Nootka Sound. And when he was a young guy, he was a fierce warrior, fighting against settlers and colonizers to try to keep them off of his land. As he became older, he became kind of interested in European society. He was baptized, converted to Christianity. He made friends with some of the original settlers, especially this guy named Doc Maynard, and actually is the namesake of the city of Seattle, which is on traditional Duwamish land. And he is also kind of emblematic of the loss of and the duplicity of the kind of dealing with native tribes, right? During his lifetime, there was deals were made between his tribe and the United States government, like we see many tribes do, to try to preserve their way of life. The government promised them money, they promised them reservations, they promised them hunting and fishing rights. But spoiler alert, those promises were not kept, right? And Chief Seattle, kind of in his later old age, becomes almost the voice of concern over what is lost, as a settler society creeps up on what was traditionally native lands, right? And the ways that kind of the capitalist mindset of modern America at that time really contrasted with traditional indigenous values. So this is like a little brief clip. I think it's only 3 minutes long of this speech. In this speech, there's been some controversies over like what actually was said, because he said it in his indigenous language. Then it was translated to a Chinook trade jargon, which was then translated to English, which was then some dude took notes about it, but didn't really, copy it word for word, and then didn't really become popular till 25 years later. So there's some steps involved, right? And if we're doing literary criticism, it's like how much exactly was said, what was lost. But it is kind of a general overview of his beliefs about like the differences between indigenous societies and their environmental relations and traditional Westerns. So watch this, and then we'll talk about how this maybe became kind of an important part of the 1970s environmental movement. What's that speech all about? What point is he trying to make in that speech? Yeah, land doesn't belong to us. We're part of nature, right? That we are connected, and that it really, this is just a little excerpt from the longer speech, right? He talks about like, wow, like we live in harmony with nature, and your cities, it makes us sick to go to your cities. They're full of, disease, and they're separated from nature, and you destroy the environment, right? And you can kind of see why I think this speech, for being kind of an obscure piece of Native American lore in the early 20th century, why by like the 1960s, 1970s, this really became popular, right? It re-emerged in popular consciousness. Why do you think that was? What's going on at that time? In like broader American culture. This is all ancient history, y'all. And it's the birth of like the environmental movement, the hippie movement, right? Again, Real Engine, you can kind of see these themes coming back together, people trying to get back in touch with the land, and really seeing the consequences of like high modernity in the 1950s, right? The rise of industrial pollution and the loss of habitat and the extinction of all these animals, right? That many people in the late 20th century kind of turned back to some of these earlier ideas to try to find some roots or some other forms of connection to nature. What I think is really interesting, this is going to kind of segue into our last little bit here, is that these things aren't just like, wow, that was like a real powerful speech, Chief Seattle, like shout out to you, right? That these are still important principles that Indigenous people of the Northwest live by today, right? They're still kind of organizing principles in their life, especially in the way they relate to the water and the land and the fish, and the rest of the environment, right? And they have been used to kind of argue for environmental protections of a lot of these groups. So let's take a look. This is especially the case in the Pacific Northwest. This is about groups that live along kind of the Oregon-Washington border, right on the Columbia River, are arguing for the removal of a number of big hydroelectric dams, right? We often think hydroelectric is a pretty great power source, right? It doesn't create pollution like coal or natural gas or something like that. It does have these environmental effects, especially on fish populations and the local environment. So tribes have been fighting to remove some of these dams, and so we'll watch this quick clip about their fight and maybe some of the reactions to that.
News tonight, 2 Pacific Northwest tribes are calling for the removal of 3 major hydroelectric dams on the Columbia River. The dams are located along the lower Columbia River, including the bottom